Welcome, Dr. Angela Sawyer.
Thank you, Dr. Chris Tanner. I think Dr. Carl calls everybody doctor.
Does he?
Yeah. So you're all doctors today.
I'm rapt that you can be with us. Angela is the lecturer in Old Testament here at Stirling, and one of your particular fields of interest and expertise is in our Old Testament text and trauma, which is why I thought it'd be great to have Angela along to share with us today. We're not all Christians here, Angela. We're a mixture of different faith traditions and spiritualities, as is indeed the great conversation of the Hebrew Bible.
Excellent, yeah.
So in that sense, we're in good company with this tradition, and looking forward to what you've got to share with us.
Great. Good to be here.
Yeah.
So my interest in Bible and trauma comes from actually a general background of, first of all, sociology in my studies. I've always been interested in the effect of trauma on a society, so particularly things such as war. But also, when I was younger, very interested in English literature. I used to be an English teacher, but particularly poetry like Wilfred Owen's war poetry and so on. So that kind of connects the literature side, and the textual side for me that I've become very interested in is a place of trauma in the biblical text and looking at some of the background there. So I'm going to take you through some of that. What I talk about is in relation to the Bible, but you can have a sacred text approach as well, that this might be a topic that's useful with other texts. And actually some of the readings that I'll bring out to you today do that. They connect biblical texts with other texts that are for local cultures and so on. But I wanted to start with a little bit of West Wing because it's always important to include West Wing in a class. This scene is from Season 2, Episode 10. If you've never watched The West Wing, in the previous season, just as a spoiler alert, someone tries to assassinate the president and some of his staff members get affected. One of them in particular, his Deputy Chief of Staff at the time, Josh Lyman, the character, is shot and nearly dies. And so this is quite a while after that event, but he has been deteriorating in his workspace in terms of his approach to other staff members and his ability to handle stress throughout that season. And this is the culminating episode that, as I was saying to Chris before, has won some Emmys. So in this episode, they also cross this story that's happening with Josh with the story of a woman who's quite traumatised when she sees a picture in the West Wing that apparently was connected to her family during the Holocaust. She was a Holocaust survivor and her family owned this picture. So we're seeing that these stories of trauma happening to two different people in two different ways. So here it kind of culminates for the character Josh. Sorry, it's a bit dark.
It was the Black J Major.
That's a nice piece.
It is.
Did he play it well?
See how young mom.
I've never heard him in person.
It's really quite something. I was just sitting there.
And then what happened?
I don't know.
In the 4th grade?
I don't know how it started.
You tasted something bitter in your mouth. It was the adrenaline. The bitter taste was the adrenaline.
What happened then?
I couldn't make it stop. You couldn't make it stop.
No, you couldn't, Josh, but you've been trying for 3 weeks, and that's why you were feeling sick inside. And what happened when you went home that night?
Mr. Lyman, are you in there?
You had an episode at the party. That afternoon, you had blown up in the Oval Office. What happened when you went home that night?
Honestly, nothing.
Okay.
I sat down on
Can
the
you
couch.
honestly tell me
I
when that pilot
pushed
committed
a magazine aside
suicide,
as a coast.
can you honestly tell me that you didn't wonder if you were suicidal too?
I didn't wonder that.
You're lying.
I didn't wonder that.
Everything that the two of you had in common.
We had nothing in
You
common.
knew you had the same
Who
birthday.
gives a damn if we had the same
But
birthday?
there's something else.
Stanley.
You knew he had been shot down once, that his plane had caught on fire, that he had ejected, and that there were some injuries.
Stanley, I made myself a drink. I pushed aside a magazine.
Josh!
As a coast.
Josh! How did you cut your hand?
Mr. Lyman, it's the silver. Mr. Lyman, are you okay in there? Mr. Lyman!
So pretty graphic scene. Katie, can I get you to just turn the lights on, please? One of the things I forgot to tell you was that there was a trigger for Josh that day in that episode. There was a story of a pilot in a plane, a very expensive military plane, who had flown the plane into a mountain. And their birth dates were the same. And it started to send Josh into this spiral of pain that he was already resonating with that birth date, but his own pain, and then his own ideas about life and death and so on. And this whole episode is about post-traumatic stress disorder and the different ways it affects different individuals and also communities. So the other character in that picture was a therapist, and they started the process where Josh is asking, I suppose you want me to sit down and tell you everything about how I feel. The therapist says, no, I don't want you to talk to me at all about how you feel. One of the situations we see keep happening for Josh in that demonstration is that he starts to relive the original trauma again and again, but he keeps trying to block it out in the process of his work. Anything else that you notice in that scene about how that trauma is demonstrated? It's not real, it's obviously a TV show. Or even the way that the therapist works with him.
It was interesting seeing how he didn't remember certain aspects of what happened that evening till he was really questioned about it. Like at first he didn't remember how he cut his hand.
Yeah.
So that was interesting, and interesting watching that exchange of whether the patient wanted to be pushed quite to the extent that the therapist
Yeah, it's pretty
was
strong,
pushing
wasn't
him.
it? Anyone else? Any other thoughts as you observe that?
It's very physical.
Yeah. Yeah. His reactions. Yep. He's sweating. He's hearing the violin as though it's a weapon, and as they go through the process, it's actually the trigger wasn't the violin. Sorry, it's a cello. Very much. The trigger is much earlier on when he walks in and there are trumpets and other musical instruments being played that he starts to resonate as being gunshots. He doesn't even realise that at the time, and it just unravels. But yeah, it's almost like he's being shot again as he sits there. Anything else that you observe? It's a great episode. So why am I showing that to you when we're talking about biblical texts? Well, one of the reasons, first of all, to set the scene, I'm sure all semester the whole topic is about trauma. And this kind of episode has been put into popular kind of culture because there is now an understanding of such a thing as PTSD. As you, I'm sure, would have discussed since the Vietnam War particularly, but it's been known of for a very long time. And in biblical scholarship now, there is an appreciation that PTSD wasn't invented in the Vietnam War or World War II or World War I, with shell shock, that it existed right throughout history, and that we find evidence of that in ancient texts as well as in modern contexts. But it's a much different process observing the PTSD we see on a screen or documentaries or people we're with today than actually trying to explore it in a text. So today we're going to look at how do you transfer some of what we can naturally observe and learn with people and with images, and how do we transfer some of that understanding from different fields of study into the study of trauma within ancient texts. So I'm just going to hand out a, I'll just get you to put that out, Trish.
Can I ask why?
Why
We're doing that.
why we're looking at biblical texts and trauma?
For ancient texts, yeah.
Yep. I'll
But
come to
why
that.
are we doing the transfer of what we're going to see today
Yep.
into an understanding of how we can see it in an ancient text?
For one thing, we need to make a jump from today to the past for the fact that they are ancient. And actually most of the understanding about post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, comes out of modern psychology. So it's one of our questions is, can we actually do that? Can we use things such as modern psychology, modern sociology and social sciences and place them back on an ancient text?
But what for?
What for? So, for one thing, to gain understanding of a text in a different way perhaps than what it's been understood before. So previously, prior to say the last 10 years to the last 30 years, prior to that in biblical studies it wasn't given a focus at all. And looking at trauma in text gives us quite a different reading of those texts than what previously existed, and perhaps a different understanding and interpretation of those texts. But also then the next step, and this is a question we'll come to later in the class, how do you then use those texts? If you're looking at context of pastoral and spiritual care, can you? Does it make a difference? So I'll come back to that question because it's kind of the question that's overlaying everything today. It's a really important one.
And can I just add to that?
Yep.
It's kind of related to what you just said, and that is that, in a sense, it's the acknowledgement of the fact that sacred texts like these often form a significant part of people's sense of spirituality and their sense of the kind of the narrative foundations that they build their lives on. And often experiences like trauma and abuse are excluded or marginalised from the way we read our sacred texts, because we always read our sacred texts through certain lenses.
Or
And
excused or
interpreting.
justified.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think it's really important that
Okay.
that we work with Angela through this stuff, because as spiritual carers, part of our core competency is listening for the way sacred texts have helped to form self-understanding, identity, spirituality, and whether or not the way they've been used has been life-giving or abusive or expansive or restrictive or any of those sorts of things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Chris. So, one of the things that we're going to come to is how the text has been used to abuse, as well as how it's been used as a place of comfort, a tool of comfort at times, or misused. So we'll explore all of those notions, and actually it's one of the questions we're going to consider in the third hour is that sense of, okay, so this might be a way we can approach it in the context of pastoral and spiritual care, but how else might that actually be exploitative or misusing? Not just the text, but the context with a person. That might not be helpful as well. Okay, so let's dive on in. Now your handout there, I've kind of, I knew that would come up really dark. but it's in front of you. Just really liked the colours in the original. This is just to show, like, there's probably things I'm missing here, but it's just to show the kind of different fields of study that we engage in biblical studies when we're looking at trauma. It's not something that has emerged alone in biblical studies. In fact, there are lots of other fields of studies that have influenced biblical studies. And there's a few that I'll mention here. So trauma studies in general, that's obviously emerged as a discipline and emerged out of different disciplines and is quite well known now. And that started to influence biblical scholars for various reasons that I'll come to. History and archaeology. The reason I mention those, they can sound dry and distant, but within those fields of history and archaeology, which are very intrinsically related to biblical studies, because we are talking about an ancient text and an ancient culture, now scholars are also exploring things such as how does trauma and the understanding of trauma affect our readings of history, and the history of ancient Israel, for example, or the ancient Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or the Egyptians, other people that we come across in the narratives of the Old and the New Testament, the Romans, the Greeks. Archaeology, so it might be as simple as recent findings of the houses that people used to live in ancient Israel dramatically changing before and after the exile. And so their physical structure of the way people lived being dramatically affected by war. Also things such as the discovery of mass graves that occurred around the time of the exile, and the kind of findings that they have through those mass graves of how people died in that time and the possible effect that those deaths may have had on the local communities. Okay? Literature studies. So trauma studies and literature studies are very intrinsically related as well. So how does trauma evidence itself in writing? How does it evidence itself in song and things such as lament, poetry? Can you see trauma in writing? How do people write about traumatic experiences, and then how do people use those writings for things such as ongoing survival of a community, reformation of identity, and so on. Psychology, I almost don't need to say anything about that. That's a given that there are areas of psychology that are very interested in trauma, survival, and the effects of that on individuals and communities. Holocaust theology. So since World War II, some of the thinking around the reasons for the Holocaust, the theological reasons, the questions that emerged, and also the writing that emerged post-Holocaust. So why in the early years after the Holocaust, say the first 20 years, were there not more descriptive writings about what occurred, but rather poetic writings and so on? You don't get a lot of historical recollection at that point in history. So then there began to be an interest in literary studies about a particular kind of genre of Holocaust writing. And refugee studies. So what is the impact of displacement on forced migrants? People who are affected by war, conflict, have had to leave their home. And there's another side to that that looks at peace studies as well. So within biblical studies, there's a whole lot of approaches to the Bible, but there are some that are more interested in the place of trauma studies than others. So you'll hear me mention these terms, but these kind of areas of biblical studies are more interested in trauma. So the reader response approach, so rather than just looking at the history, actually looking at what impact does it have when someone reads or hears or engages with these texts today. Social scientific approaches, feminist studies. So feminist studies have often, within biblical studies, looked at texts that affect women particularly and power structures, and in times of war, particularly things like sexual violence that increase, how that's demonstrated within the biblical text becomes of interest to feminist studies. Post-colonial studies, so what kind of powers existed, how do people function under an oppressive power, how do they write in that space, If they've been invaded as a country and they still live within that space, how do they communicate? What do we read that's propaganda from an imperial overlord, or what do we read that's actually a counter voice within the text? So liberation theology, which emerged from South American kind of Catholic groups that originally began to look at issues of justice and a different approach to reading texts of the Bible, that has influenced trauma studies massively. We're going to spend some time on contextual Bible study, so I won't say much about that now. And then theodicy. So theodicy about the question about human suffering and the relationship between human suffering and God and righteousness and sin. All of that became a question within particularly the Old Testament. So any questions about that so far, the different fields of study? I mentioned that up front just to give you some background, because you're going to be hearing it again and again, and recognise that there's not just one approach to trauma studies in the Bible. There's all these different lenses that it comes through.
I find it really interesting, Angela, that all of these, I suppose you'd call them hermeneutic approaches, wouldn't you? They acknowledge the ancient Hebrew texts as authoritative in and of their own. That they stand alone in that sense. And often, in particular in the Christian tradition, some of us only read the Old Testament texts through a lens of the New Testament.
Yes.
And what this little Venn diagram's inviting us to is a sense that these stories connect with our modern story on so many different levels, not just the traditional Christological narrative. And so it actually opens up the ancient Hebrew text to a broad range of spiritualities and understandings of human life and wrestling with these questions.
I'll actually come to some of those examples as well, where when we're talking about trauma in the Bible, as I mentioned before, it's not just Christian cultures or Jewish cultures it's talking about. It can be trauma of other cultures as well. But that's a really good observation. And the other thing to say, and I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar, but the dominance of trauma studies in biblical studies is the Hebrew Bible. There are some emerging New Testament scholars who are interested in that area, but if you start to look at a lot of the examples I'll bring up today are from the Hebrew Bible rather than the New Testament, which is quite interesting in itself. And one of the reasons might be because of this. So I've just given you a bit of a rundown of some of the historical events that just on a surface level, if we're going to look at trauma in the Bible, understanding some of the historical events connected to the writing, we may find more examples in those spaces. So when we actually just read the Bible, we can see that there are many accounts of individual traumas. So it might be the loss of a child, a situation of barrenness, rape, so on. You'll come across many different individual stories. But it's the national crises and the communal trauma that a lot of trauma studies spends time on. So the history of Israel is littered with stories of invasion, of even the rape of the concubine, which could be an individual trauma. This is a story in the book of Judges, actually led to a national crisis. Stories of famine, stories of exile and land loss. The division of the kingdom after Solomon's rule, the northern kingdom. For anyone that's done Hebrew Bible, would have heard me say again and again, in the northern kingdom they had blood coup after blood coup and numerous massacres in that period of time. And the northern kingdom had a catastrophic end with the invasion from Assyria and the end of those northern tribes by 722 BC. And we'll spend a bit of time looking at the Assyrian practices of war, because there's a lot of evidence around about what the Assyrians did and particularly their siege warfare and the psychological effects of that style of warfare that they perfected, and that all empires then went on to take on, including Israel. So during this period of time, it wasn't just about one invasion, it was about ongoing invasions, and there was enormous pressure on Judah as well in the south. And we see that psychological pressure of constant threat of invasion going on for well over 100 years. I've mentioned the Lachish letters there, and I'll come back to that later. So then we have I've put in bold the exile of Judah in 586 BCE by Babylon, because in terms of the way that the Hebrew Bible particularly understands its own history, this is seen as the massive watershed crisis. It gave rise to the writing down of much of the Old Testament, and the parts that were already written being formulated into the canon that we have today. So it's crisis that really gave rise to much of the Old Testament being written down. So a lot of trauma studies began out of an historical study of the exile. And the exile, the Babylonian exile, but also the Assyrian exile, involved a number of different factors. War, invasion, ongoing conflict, but mass deportations of the population. So those who survived and anyone that had any kind of leadership or wealth were taken out of the land. And the way the Bible talks about that is quite ambiguous. At times it says all of the population are deported, and in other times it's only a certain amount of the population. And that deportation involved loss of liberty, the loss of independence, and the loss of the land. The Assyrians and the Babylonians also had a raised earth policy, which meant they came and burnt and to the ground. And those layers of destruction are found in archaeology as well. Also, enormous political upheaval, and then the lack of leadership and the kind of ongoing trauma for generations. So just as a small example, for the first generation of forced deportations population that were taken to Babylon, they went on to have families, children, third generation. It was that long before they returned to the land, but the ones who returned to a land that was almost impossible to grow crops in, for example, because that had been the idea of the invasion. It was not only will I destroy what you have, but for those people who come back, they will see those signs of trauma on the land forever, like for a long time. They also had the end of the monarchy and the loss of theological symbols such as the temple. I keep moving out of your range, don't I? Okay, so the Old Testament is much longer in its time duration and its length, so the events are going to be more. When we're talking about New Testament, we're talking about 30 to 100 years. So there are fewer historical events to name, but they are significant, and they're significant in the text. So in terms of the areas of interest in trauma studies, we have, well, the Gospels begin with Herod's massacre of children, often brushed over at Christmas time, but that's a very traumatic story to start with. Roman imperial rule, so Israel at this point was not an independent state. That produced a lot of identity crisis, and we see some of those ructions within the text. The crucifixion story itself is a traumatic, singular event that Christianity based its story around. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, again, equal in terms of its devastation as the Babylonian exile originally was. And from this point on, the diaspora of the Jews and then the Roman persecution of the early Christians. So the whole Christian story in its inception has many points of references to trauma and survival. So we often link those two terms together, that it's not just about trauma. So any thoughts or reflections on those kind of historical events?
I often wonder, actually, also what it was like to be a Roman soldier. You know, having to be a Roman soldier at the ends of the known world in that sense,
Yeah.
and also in the context of Jewish resistance to.
Yes.
To
They
that
weren't wanted,
occupation.
were they?
They weren't wanted, and many of them were assassinated, as we know.
Mm.
And so the sort of colonial conundrum that unfolds seems to be terrorising for everyone. Well, not everyone, but people from every perspective, I suppose, in that sense. Yeah.
Yep, you've got clashes set up all over the place there, on an individual and a national level, and some of that we see evidenced in the text.
Yeah.
So understanding some of that Roman overrule, when you read the book of Revelation in the New Testament through that lens, and you're reading about, there's a lot of death in Revelation, there's a lot of trauma in that book, when you see that imperial situation that people are under, they don't necessarily write it in a straightforward way about the impact of that trauma on them. And they draw on a lot of the trauma that they pick up from the Old Testament to explain their new current situation. And that's the difference between, in a sense, trauma literature and survival literature. So survival literature is taking on those texts of trauma and reframing them as stories to explain their current situation and new identities. Okay, so I've already mentioned some of these informing kind of studies to biblical studies. And when we read anything about Bible and trauma, it's worth taking a step back and going, okay, where's the overlap happening here? Which perspective is this coming from? So as I said before, up until about the 1990s, the study of exile was not given any space or time really in biblical studies. You might find one or two books of early innovators. But a lot of scholars throughout the 20th century and the 19th century were just, okay, the Bible doesn't say much about the exile, so we'll ignore it. We'll spend a lot of time looking at the Exodus and other events in the Bible. And it wasn't until certain people such as, and I'll show you some of these throughout the class, but a scholar such as Daniel Smith Christopher, he went to do his study at Oxford, and he was looking at exile and the loss of land, and next door to him was the Oxford Refugee Studies Centre that had been set up to look at the space of trauma for refugees. And he just started to make those connections and go, why have we downplayed this part of Israel's history so much? And we think that because the Bible doesn't explain that event in the way we would expect, that it means it wasn't traumatic. He began to really look at literature of trauma and use that lens to study the Bible as well. And that really began a ballooning interest in trauma studies. Post-colonial studies has emerged, it started in terms of a literary focus, looking at, say, texts that emerged in India under colonial rule, and how some of them looked like they were supporting the colonial rule but were actually subversive. And biblical studies took a great interest into that as well, to see, are we seeing a similar thing coming through in the Bible during the Persian rule, during the Babylonian rule? Things that seem to be pro-Persian, so you might read the book of Esther, for example, that seems pro-Persian, but is it actually underneath? Is there a resistance going on there? I mean, that whole story is about the attempted genocide of a people again, or is it? So that's one of the things that post-colonial studies brings, and so on. So I've already really mentioned a lot of those. And this is where we start to see, once the interest began, people began to actually read these texts differently than they'd previously been read.
Angela, can I just interrupt there and ask a question?
Of course.
How do we identify, and this is probably you'd do a whole unit on this probably, but how do we identify when a piece of literature is being subversive?
Yeah.
Because the way literature is used in that sense is often with a dominant narrative that seems to be the conventional narrative. Yeah. But then there are stories that kind of cut that narrative off at the knees in a sense. And I'm thinking of Mark Brett's portrayal of Genesis as a document that subverts the kind of the move towards purity in Ezra and Nehemiah. That you know, the
Contradicts
dominant
it almost.
narrative seems to be one of purity, but the sub-narrative is actually one that suggests that that in this case God was actually not concerned with purity in that sense.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a standard way of reading texts in that, or are there numerous ways of reading texts?
So I think particularly looking at post-colonial studies, biblical studies is really taking its cues from that. So looking for signs of, like on that second half of your handout, towards the bottom, I've got a whole list of literary features that you'll see to look for trauma in a text or trauma survival in a text. But post-colonialism in particularly suggests things like mimicry and mockery.
Right, yeah.
So mimicry is taking on, it looks like you're saying, I agree with all the governmental policies and isn't it wonderful, and you lay it out, but actually that mimicry, there's a mockery side underneath it.
Yeah.
That's actually, sometimes it might be the way that a leader is referenced just doesn't sit quite right. And if you knew, so in the book of Revelation, for example, the big enemy being Babylon, well, any reader at the time knew this isn't Babylon, this is the Romans that they're talking about. They're using Babylon as a code that was commonly known, but you couldn't get pinned on.
Yeah, you couldn't get hauled up.
So when you're under a colonial situation, and you're going to get in trouble if you stand up and say, I don't want this rule here, you've also got to acquiesce to that rule.
Yeah.
So some people suggest that that's what we're seeing in Daniel as well, which seems like, it's all supportive, pro-government policy there, but is it actually subversive for things like his diet, the way that he's standing against some of the practices of the time, and in the text it's not condemning that. It's not saying it's insubordination. Yeah. So a lot of those cues come out of post-colonial studies, I think. And feminist studies would have a different approach as well to what they're seeing.
I think it's a really important thing from the perspective of spiritual care, because often we're listening to people who are defined by dominant ways of reading the text.
Yes.
And it can be really empowering when we're able to invite people to consider that there may be a different way of reading this text, that in fact it's been used this way for you all these years. Yeah. But in fact, did you know that if you read it slightly differently, it might suggest a different thing that can often be really empowering for a person.
So that comes up particularly in the area of trauma when we look at the issue of sin and righteousness.
Yeah.
So and this comes into Holocaust studies as well. So if the narrative, the dominant narrative has been, you sin, you get punished, you deserve this trauma, and then those texts are used to continue to reinforce that idea. If you give a counter text that actually challenges that idea, such as Job, for example, the book of Job, where an innocent man is suffering, and it's going to come to that in a minute, but it kind of picks up on that point, that actually that can give an alternative narrative to somebody in trauma that has taken on the dominant narrative that compounds the trauma in a sense.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Angela.
Yes.
Another point is that thinking about like King Saul, who was experiencing that the confusion in his life. Yeah. He was can't sleep, and he was so in the way that he need David to play the harps for him to let him have that relaxation. Yeah. How does it connect with this?
Absolutely. Excellent example. And that's where psychology really comes in. And so we're going to kind of break up into different groups at the end and do three different kind of approaches to looking at trauma in text. But one of the approaches is psychological. So if we're going to use modern psychology and look at a character like Saul, what kind of questions will we ask about his behaviour, what is said about him, what's going on with the family and so on. And the thing with psychology, it's so broad, you actually have to choose a particular approach. It became very popular in biblical studies at certain times to do these psychological profiles. But there's debate within psychology and there's debate within biblical studies about that as well. But I'm going to get you to do one on Ezekiel, who's also a very interesting troubled character. Another couple of other things I'd like to add to that about the informing text of trauma approach, like the things that have informed us. I think things such as the global terrorism threat it's actually led to, I didn't even put it on the resources list, but I'll pop it up at the end. A project that's going on in the United Kingdom in the Anglican Church there at the moment, where the Templeton Foundation has given an enormous amount of money to clergy training and dealing with people in trauma and using biblical texts of trauma that stemmed out of some of the terrorist events that occurred in the United Kingdom. Because the clergy were feeling completely unprepared we have all these people coming into our spaces traumatised by these events, and that's a new approach to dealing with these texts of trauma. Another one that I'd add to that list is also the growing transparency in relation to the sexual abuse crisis. So actually the way we talk about sex and the way we talk about abuse in our society has led to a growing interest in how do we use the Bible and how do we read sexual abuse texts in the Bible, because they're there. There are many accounts of sexual assault, as well as the Bible being used to justify sexual assault. So that's just to give you, like, most of this is background, like why this has become so important in biblical studies, but also the different ways that we've approached it. And I think we can kind of sum up the dominant ways as being about asking different questions. So some of the questions are about formation and composition. So how the biblical text actually emerged. David Carr has written a book about the traumatic origins of the Bible and traced through the whole story of the Bible and looked at all the traumatic events that gave rise to its writing down. So many scholars have done this with sections of the Bible, whereas David Carr's done it with the whole Bible. As you just mentioned, the psychological profile of a text or an author or the characters. So these are the ones that are very common. So looking at Job, Ezekiel, someone like Tamar, who's a woman in the text that has experienced rape, Jeremiah. So whenever we've seen characters in the Bible displaying trauma, they've been popular ones for this. But Saul is a really good example, actually. Bathsheba, the servant, so in Isaiah, you'll often hear of the servant songs during Easter as messianic passages. Well, a lens of trauma has been put across those passages as well to see, well, this is somebody who's suffering, and the suffering is seen as a vicarious suffering on behalf of the whole community. That's actually the image that's taken up in Jesus in the New Testament as well. And then one person I'm particularly interested in is the character of Zion. So this is a personification of the city of Jerusalem, personified as a woman in the text, and often a woman who has been divorced, assaulted, lost her children, and in a situation of war. So, and there are many questions about why is she written in this way, why is she written as a personification? And that brings us back to what kind of features are there in text of trauma. So literary and textual studies, and that's what I've talked about already about trauma and survival literature. So just reading the text as a text, in the same way you'd study like a Wilfred Owen poem that shows what World War I was like, or something from the Holocaust, or something from any place and time of trauma, that the Bible can be studied in such a way as well. And then the other major area is the use of the Bible for pastoral, psychological and or therapeutic benefit in context of individual and collective community trauma. And that link actually is the one that I was talking about in the UK. How the Bible, as for some communities, as an inherent text within that community, can be used as something of value in their recovery from trauma. So, and that's the link there to David Carr's book, Holy Resilience, the Bible's Traumatic Origins. And that quote there from him, the Jewish and Christian scriptures define these communities in ways that have helped these communities endure catastrophe rather than be devastated by it. Perhaps most important, the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity, written in part as a response to communal suffering, presents suffering as a broader story of redemption. So they take that suffering that happened and put a framework around it that gave meaning to the suffering, and then the people took that on as a sacred text that gave them a sense of their place in the world and why that suffering occurred, and also gave them hope. So some texts that we read as quite traumatic for people within trauma may actually present hope, or may actually give them words they can't actually say themselves, because language and trauma are strongly related areas, and the loss of language is often a result of trauma. So being able to put words to something, even if it's somebody else's words who has survived trauma, can help people narrate their own story.
And that really relates very, very specifically to spirituality, what spirituality is, isn't it? Because you talked about framing meaning, finding reasons why, re-establishing identity, establishing hope, and they're all things that are recognised as elements of spirituality in most recent attempts to define what spirituality is in a post-religious kind of context. So it's really, really interesting that that's embodied in the
It's
text.
actually going to get us to look at one of these texts of supposed hope in a moment and see what we actually find, how much hope there is and how much trauma there is. Just to show you a few of these resources around, I've just shown you this one, The Biblical Theology of Exile. This book goes into depth into some of the historical information we have about the exile and the traumatic situation, and then it actually picks up on some particular texts and sees how you can read them through the lens of trauma. So looking at things like Ezra and Nehemiah and the stance on purity, that seems so exclusivist, but when you read that through the lens of a traumatised population that are under threat of loss through assimilation, how do you read those differently? These are all in your resources list, by the way. This book here also began to look at exile and has a section that specifically looks at psychology and trauma and picks up on some specific responses that can be given in terms of a biblical text linking with context of trauma. And they're quite diverse. So, for example, following Hurricane Katrina, how texts of trauma can be read with people surviving a natural disaster. And then another text that looks at Dinka refugees in America and their use of narratives of exodus and exile in reframing their own situation of becoming refugees and so on. So this is a fascinating text. 20 years ago, you never would have seen something like this coming out in biblical studies. Whereas now, the understanding that context matters, modern context and ancient context matters in the situations, and that trauma can affect your reading of something presently, but also in the writing of something in the past. I wanted to show you this one, which I've also brought with me. I've brought a number of these because I found this really interesting approach. So I heard this guy speak, Federico Villanueva. He's an Old Testament scholar from the Philippines, a Catholic. And after Typhoon Yolanda, which was a massive typhoon that hit the Philippines, he worked with a psychologist in the area where this typhoon hit. And they worked together on how to use a form of lament. So particularly looking at the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament, which is all about lament, but picking up on Filipino laments that were indigenous within that area and using that to help them give voice to the trauma that they were facing. So he links the trauma that gave rise to the Book of Lamentations, the end of Jerusalem at the time through the Babylonian invasion. He links that with trauma studies, with Typhoon Yolanda, and then with indigenous Filipino poetry. And one of the things that they discovered in that study, working with the psychologist, was that for the people, they had taken in a form of response within Catholicism that said you can't grieve. You've been through this big crisis, you can't ask why. And the lament form gave them permission to start to grieve and give voice to their pain. So the Bible for that community was an indigenous text as well. It's something that they valued and used, so it seemed a natural space for them to use that text as well as the Filipino poetry that had actually been really repressed. So he linked those texts. So that's a really fascinating approach. Jeremiah, so another commentary, this commentary by Kathleen O'Connor. So just again, another commentary on the Bible, but it actually begins its first chapter writing some imaginary stories about people caught up in the exile that we don't find in Jeremiah, to try to fill in the gaps that are there in the text. And she uses trauma studies to read this book. Fascinating, really well written commentary as well. And I mentioned before contextual Bible study. So Gerald West is a biblical scholar in South Africa, again Old Testament, and he developed a form of Bible study that's informed by liberation theology and adapted it to the South African context. He developed this under apartheid, South Africa, and this form of Bible study prioritises the poor. So the groups come together and they look at very difficult biblical texts that are very rarely preached or spoken about. He takes those up, and the groups that study these texts are generally very marginalised groups. They look at their own context, they look at the text, and then they link to what they do with that. And they're often very traumatised communities. So we're going to actually do one of these studies later on. One of the groups will do that. A study that's been developed for people who have either had or been affected by HIV in their community, which is very common in that area in South Africa, and really gives them voice. Now, a lot of these people who do these studies are illiterate. They don't read the Bible, but the Bible is part of their culture. And that's quite different to here, for example. So when I'm talking about this in your pastoral and spiritual care context, it's not necessarily the Bible that would be used in this kind of process. But for what I'm looking at today, a culture like this, the Bible is part of that community, valued by that community, but possibly not read in the way that they've done it in this group.
I think you've described a dynamic that's important for traumatised people too, in terms of the use of the text.
Yeah, yes.
Because often people whose frameworks of meaning in describing their experience and why it happened and so on come to them from an understanding of the text that's kind of top down. It's imposed upon them by an organisation or by just a dominant narrative in their life, and that there's a dissonance or a breaking of that framework of meaning because their experience doesn't accord with the text, the way the text's been imposed on them.
Yeah.
And what you're describing, contextuality or emphasis on contextuality, does for people is gives them the power to reread the text from their own experience.
From their place.
So they can actually frame meaning in the text on the basis of their actual experience. And that's an empowering...
So empowering, and probably needs to be understood what a shift this approach was from traditional biblical scholarship and study. So in traditional biblical scholarship, it's all about objectivity. The Bible says this is what it means. It doesn't matter whether you're in Australia, South Africa, America. The Bible is fixed. It's got a fixed position. And this approach is it's the opposite, really, as far away as you can get from that. It's saying your position in society, your context actually matters. And that's actually true for all of biblical study. And it began to be understood, well, actually there was never any fixed position on what the text says. It was either a German, white, middle class, male approach to scripture that told everyone this is what it says. Or it was the priest who alone held that text and the power over the text, as you're saying there, example. So this goes far, almost back to some of the approaches in Judaism and early Christianity, which was, hey, this is your text. What does it mean?
It's interesting because it also highlights the value of faith communities and churches looking at the whole Bible. Often churches you talk about mostly passages that support their view or their certain theology, and there's lots of passages that are left out. But it's especially with the trauma studies, it's good to look at the challenging text and go, hang on, there's also another theology here. It's not just one single theology in the Bible.
And in that approach, often the texts that we miss out on are the really difficult but rich texts. So I think it was the reading from Tribble,
Yes.
Texts of Terror. So if you haven't had a chance to have a look at that, do. And that's where the feminist literary studies came in, but really picked up on texts that had been completely ignored. Very rarely would ever hear talked on or explored in a Bible study, never on the liturgy, never on the, okay, this is what we're looking at this week. And most of those texts tend to involve women, and they tend to involve situations that are complex and difficult to explain. So rather than avoid them in trauma studies, it's actually let's actually look at them, because they're the ones that are rich and resonant. Now I know I've been going through an enormous amount of information for background purposes. Any thoughts or questions before we take a break and come back to actually look at some? I'll get you to actually look at some texts. It's always bad to ask, does anyone have any questions before a break? Everyone else is sitting there going, don't have it. I want a cup of tea.
Are you seeing the Bible as a book of philosophy or as a history?
So,
or as a...
Me personally, or in terms of biblical scholarship?
In terms of biblical scholarship.
So it can be looked at in a multiplicity of ways. So in biblical scholarship, well, even the pile of authors that we have here, they're all going to come at it from different directions. Some are going to value philosophy over history, some are going to look at history, some of them are going to look at the text as authoritative, theologically, not all are. So there's a whole spectrum of responses and approaches to that text. But I think the perspective that I'm trying to take today is about a sacred text approach. About recognising that this is a text that is valued and considered important in communities and holds a space for them.
I guess the reason I've come to that question is some of the reading that we got this week was a story.
Yes.
I didn't, in reading it as someone who's not Christian, I didn't achieve a sense of the spiritual in it. I didn't find a philosophy that I could learn from.
Yep.
It seemed like a story, and I wondered, and listening to you now, I'm understanding what I wanted. I wondered, what does that mean? This is a sacred text. My understanding of a sacred text in my tradition is not, that's not true. There are some stories, but there are philosophical underpinnings to all of it. And I'm just wondering if that's the case.
Such as what kind of philosophical underpinnings?
Well, like the Bhagavad Gita is a story.
Yep.
But it has very strong philosophical underpinning to it and a teaching element to it. And the reading that we got this week, I didn't find that. And I wondered, it goes back to my question, what for? What is that for if it's not if it's a sacred text? What is it for if it doesn't have that aspect underneath it? Or maybe because I'm not Christian, I couldn't see that.
Yep. So one of the complexities we have with particularly Hebrew Bible, but also the New Testament, is that they are all different types of literature, and they're not necessarily all doctrinal, for example. So the reading that you have this week is not a reading as such as this is the teaching and how you should respond, or it's a story to engage in. But in some senses, all texts are. The horizon of the text and the horizon of the reader meets, and in biblical studies they talk about that being the space that meaning occurs within the interaction in the text. So in Phyllis Tribble's approach to texts of terror, so a story of a person being raped, there have been teachings taken out of those kind of readings. But one of the challenges we have with a text such as that is they're not often surrounded by, and this is the way you should think about it. So it allows for multiple readings and multiple interpretations, but that's a philosophical approach in itself that says that, because there are other approaches to that text that would say there is only one way you can read this, and you, as Chris talked about before, you have to read it through the lens of, say, a New Testament reading and so on. So there's definitely different approaches within Christianity to the Bible itself. A literalist approach, you read it as it is and it tells you what to do, ranging all the way to I take this bit and this bit, but I don't take that bit.
I guess my readings of sacred texts are generally, if I'm reading the Upanishads, there is an exploration of meaning, and you don't have to agree with what's being said. It's an opening.
Yes.
It's an invitation to explore, and I didn't understand, for example, in that reading that we got, what that invitation was.
Whereas Ecclesiastes might be quite a different experience, which is all about finding meaning.
Yeah.
Or when you get the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, which is a teaching, Jesus standing on a mountain teaching. So the Bible has a whole diversity of not just texts, but then approaches to those texts.
So what are those bits for? The ones that, like the reading that we're, and I don't know if I'm annoying, I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
That's your job.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's it for? If it's not if it's it seemed to me to be a story of trauma.
Yep.
What is the purpose of having it in there? Why am I given this as part of the Bible to read?
So you know, Katie's seen this image a million times as a kind of a timeline of Israel's history in the Old Testament.
Not me, no.
But
it's not where I live.
One of the things that we know when we study Old Testament is that the Bible does a number of things in its text, but some of what it does is it tells the story of Israel. So what you were reading within that story is a particular story within the book of Judges about a particular time in Israel.
Yes.
That is presented.
Yes.
Now, is there theological meaning under that? Absolutely. Are there feminist readings under that? Absolutely. But it's not going to tell you that. Whereas you'll get to a book like Proverbs, which is actually really hard to locate in a timeline, which isn't about the history of Israel as such, but it's more about proverbial ways and thinking of living. And in the Jewish community, they took up these multiple texts as not only a record of their history, but also different approaches to God, to life, to faith, to their nation. So it really is about, okay, where is that story located? How do I step out of the reading of it? Now, there are different approaches that say you don't have to do that. But if you're asking the questions, I would say it's helpful because when you go to a text like that without any other background to that story, first of all, it's really hard to know what genre this is, so what style of writing is it in, and then what are the expectations of that. So if I read Judges, how differently to that than if I read, say, Leviticus, a book of law.
Of law, Elijah, right.
Yeah. And then the question we have today is, okay, this text of law or this book of history or what is actually in Jewish tradition a former prophet, how did they read it then? And then how do we read it today? And how do we apply it? So what does that mean for us today? And I would suggest that would mean a multiplicity of things to different readers. So for you, the experience or even the expectations of what to go to in that text and find might be quite different than for somebody else. But it definitely is not a text that is trying to say, this is what you should think, or...
No, and nor are the texts that I read.
Yeah.
They're not telling me, they're
But you see a spiritual philosophy underneath.
They're offering some thoughts for exploration, and that's what I saw in the reading that I did was a story.
Yes.
And it was a story of bad behaviour, and it seemed fairly straightforward, and I wasn't sure.
Which was it the unnamed woman?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were going to say something?
When I was reading that one, it was I found it was connecting with today's situation.
Yeah.
The feminism and the woman abused and traumatized and killed.
Yeah.
I mean, it had a connection with the modern the situation today.
Yes.
I mean, many women are being abused, and I mean, it was very meaningful for me anyway.
Yeah.
But there's a self-evidence in it.
Yeah. But there wasn't for a lot of earlier readers, even before Tribble's analysis of it.
Okay.
So she took a literary feminist approach.
Yeah.
That wasn't the typical way of reading it prior to her work. First of all, it wouldn't have been a text that was often studied. It would have been just ignored or considered too difficult. And also that the approach would have been, okay, this is really helpful for us about the national story of Israel. It's nowhere near saying copy this or do this, but what Phyllis Tribble was doing was suggesting, okay, let's put the woman in the centre of this story. One thing, she's not even named, the story doesn't even put her at the centre of the story. So she changes the focus within that approach to actually bring out issues of feminism, about the woman being abused. The bad behaviour seems obvious, but it's not necessarily, the focus is not necessarily on the harm done to her, it's on the power that the men have lost. So if that text is then read and thought that way, then how is that then possibly enacted as this is the way you treat women in society?
I think the other thing that's really interesting with Judaism, which is a big difference today, is that Judaism wasn't just a religion, it was a whole culture. So history was sort of theological, even if it was just straight history, because their whole culture was embedded in theology. So even like a seemingly like story that isn't really having any like direct meaning had sort of a theological meaning to it because the whole culture was like embedded in that.
Yeah. And that's part of the, in Judaism, the desire to put stories alongside of doctrinal teaching, alongside of law, alongside of poetry. That the theological approach was all about the whole of life in that sense. And in some texts, so the Book of Esther, for example, you don't hear God mentioned at all. So why is it in the Bible? And it brings up a whole lot of questions about nationalism and what is considered righteous and just living. Really good questions about how to approach these different texts. And you go to the one in Judges compared to the one I'm going to show you after the break, vastly different in style, writing, and possibly our response as well, and usefulness to us today in context of trauma.
Just say a little more about what you brought up the issue about the even other religions. In their text also there are stories where like Ramayana and like Islam.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
Mahabharata is one huge big long history story.
As far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh and so on.
Yes.
So some of those parts of the story about eternal life and seeking that spiritual formation and identity, some of it's about being on a boat. Very similar to Noah's Ark story. And some of that profundity is really found in the reading, not necessarily in the writing. Let's take a break. 15 minutes, is that your usual?
Yep.
So if we come back here at 5:02, and then I'm going to actually get you to look at a text and let's deal with some texts of trauma together.